We do have a hard stop right before 9 o'clock, so just want to remind everybody for that. And Chair calls Timothy Barton. We show you registered as Timothy Barton on behalf of Wall Builders, and you'll be testifying for the bill. Is that correct?
Sir.
All right, we begin.
In 1925, there was a cross put up in Bladensburg, Maryland. It was a World War I memorial cross to honor those who had lost their lives in World War I. There were 49 individuals who were being honored by that cross. That cross was challenged and went all the way to the Supreme Court. And in 2019, the Supreme Court upheld that cross was allowed to stand on government property. The reason was the Supreme Court said there was a long-standing tradition, and if there's a long-standing historic tradition, it should be considered as constitutional. Now, we've already heard. The other component in this was the Lemon decision, and the Supreme Court said last year that unconditionally Lemon is overturned. Those were the two things, those kind of standards that have changed the dynamic of where we are today. This is the actual copy of the Ten Commandments that was in Kentucky that led to the Stone v. Graham decision. This is the copy that was hanging on a school classroom actually was in the school hallway, when the individual was offended and said it shouldn't be there. That went to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court said, yeah, based on Lemon, that should not be there anymore. However, up until 1980, we can go back to the very beginning of education. In 1690, the first education textbook was printed in English in America. It was known as the New England Primer. I have several original New England Primers with me. It was printed from 1690 all the way to the early 1900s. It was a foundation of education. These are ones from the 17 and 1800s. And in the back of every one of these, one of the things students were required to do was to memorize the Ten Commandments. And in fact, in the back of the New England Primer is Westminster's Shorter Catechism, and it has more than 40 questions that students had to learn about the Ten Commandments. If you go to the 1800s, Noah Webster, who gave us Webster's Dictionary, he wrote a education book that was used, a history book, that was actually used in public schools. This is that history book. It was done in 1832, and he actually gives a breakdown of the Ten Commandments and how it's a foundation of all of Western civilization and then law in Western civilization. If you go forward to McGuffey's Readers came out in the late 1800s. More than 100 million copies of McGuffey's Readers were sold, and in McGuffey's Readers, again, were the Ten Commandments. The point I would like to illustrate is that if we look at the Ten Commandments and follow the standard the Supreme Court has set of a long-lasting historic tradition, it's unquestionable the Ten Commandments have been a long-lasting historic tradition in education in America, and it was not until 1980 that an activist court got involved and said we will no longer display the Ten Commandments in schools in America. The history of our nation has been a nation where we understood we needed a moral compass, and we knew the basis of morals of all Western civilization was rooted in the Ten Commandments. With it being said as well, the moral component of this is becoming vitally important. We are seeing a world and society around us in decay, and we are seeing more and more issues in schools where there is violent crime. We're seeing more and more young people involved in shootings and murders, and there's a level of irony, a sad irony, when we would send people to jail for stealing and for killing, and yet we're saying that students should not be able to see the very things they would go to jail for, the foundation of morals in Western society. It would certainly make sense, as we are seeing a moral decay, and if we want the best for our students, we would show them the historic traditional moral standard upon which all Western civilization was birthed and born, and something that arguably, if we had more people following the Ten Commandments, we would solve so many of the issues we are seeing today. It was not long ago. We saw a shooter go into a Christian school in Nashville, and this shooter shot up the Christian school. If more students were learning things like don't kill other people, the world would be a far better place if they had, again, this basic moral standard. What I want to encourage is the two easy evidences we can point to: long-lasting historic tradition in education. And I've brought only a few samples. I can go through numerous examples. This is part of the historic tradition of America, but also it's the basis of morals. And I think we would all agree we want our students to grow up with a moral compass. And the Ten Commandments has been the historic tradition of morals of Western civilization. I thank you for your time.
Members, any questions for this witness? All right, we appreciate you being here this morning.
Thank you.
So who is Timothy Barton?
Tim Barton is the son of David Barton, who is kind of the granddaddy of Christian nationalist disinformation. So many of the myths and lies and the disinformation that's floating around out there about America being founded as a Christian nation and based on Judeo-Christian principles, you can trace right back to David Barton and his group, Wall Builders. So Tim Barton is just kind of, born into this disinformation space. And that's who's testifying about this bill at the Texas legislature. It's unbelievable.
And who is Andrew Seidel?
Andrew Seidel is me. I am a constitutional attorney. I've been litigating this kind of stuff for more than a decade now, though mostly I'm in the communications space now and no longer fighting this in court. It's been about a year. I also happen to be the author of this book, The Founding Myth, Why Christian Nationalism is Un-American, which has an entire section on why the Ten Commandments are not actually the basis of American law, debunking the disinformation that you heard at that testimony. And this new book, American Crusade, How the Supreme Court is Weaponizing Religious Freedom, which also has a lot of relevance to the testimony that we're going to talk about.
I have read both of those books, and I highly recommend both of those books to anyone watching now. So one of the many crazy things that this guy Barton said was, one, the Lemon test was unconditionally overturned.
Yeah. I mean, that's not accurate. I mean, obviously he's not a lawyer. He doesn't have a full understanding of the law. The Lemon test, for people who don't know, and I'm going to try to avoid legalese here, which is also what I try to do in the book. But it's a case that is really important that was decided by the Supreme Court in 1971. So it's about 5 decades of precedent, right? And what the court did in that case was it surveyed all of the times, basically, that religion and the law had collided, all of the times courts had written opinions about the separation of church and state. And it synthesized those cases into this simple 3-part test to determine whether a particular government action crosses that line, whether it violates the separation of church and state. And basically what the test they came up with was, does it have a secular purpose? Does it have a primary effect that advances or inhibits religion? And does it foster an excessive entanglement of the government with religion? And if the government action fails any one of those 3 prongs, it violates the Constitution. And it's really important to note that, I mean, this is strong precedent, right? It's older than Roe versus Wade. This is an 8-1 decision that's based on all these earlier decisions that the court issued. And it has been attacked by Christian nationalist legal outfits and judges over the years because the separation of church and state is really the cure to Christian nationalism. So they've been trying to tear down that wall of separation for a long time. It's not quite accurate to say that Lemon was completely undone. So if you go back and, for instance, if you read the Dobbs opinion, which overturned Roe versus Wade, it specifically says in that opinion, we are overturning Roe versus Wade. In the cases that they're talking about involving the Lemon test, it's not been explicitly overturned. The justices keep hacking at it in decision after decision, but they're also not leaving the lower courts with much to do other than this vague sort of, which is what you hear these people arguing about, history and tradition nonsense, which was also one of the misbegotten legs of Barton's testimony here.
Yeah. Well, the woman who presented this bill, Candy Noble, was talking about how America had freedom of religion until they imposed the Lemon test, and then she thought that freedom of religion stopped at that point, because I guess she thought that and I've heard this from Christian nationalists, that they think freedom of religion means freedom of Christianity, and I've heard politicians say that other faiths don't have freedom of religion.
Yeah. I mean, that's what American Crusade, the new book, is all about, right? This misunderstanding. You cannot have freedom of religion without the separation of church and state, right? And that's what the Lemon test did, was ensure that there is a separation of church and state. The separation of church and state is a prerequisite to true religious freedom. And any religious freedom that says you can use the machinery of the state to impose your religion on other people, for instance, by displaying your holy scripture to a captive audience of school children on the room of public school classrooms, that is a basic just perversion of religious freedom. I mean, that is the weaponization of religious liberty. It's been happening for a long time.
Yeah. So one of the ways that they said that they were going to do this, or that Timothy was saying that he was going to do this, was you allowed a cross at one point in our history. So they let this cross stand. They didn't recognize that it was a violation of the First Amendment. And when that was pointed out, well, then they made some kind of permission. We're like, well, it doesn't really matter. So what's a little white lie kind of argument? Okay, so we did this one thing. Two wrongs don't make a right. Well, now that we got the second wrong. And so you allowed a textbook from 1690. So we allowed a textbook that existed before the United States existed, and therefore the United States could not have prohibited such a book. And then, of course, we have had many other people.
I mean, it's pretty remarkable.
Candy Noble said that the Lemon Test was trying to stop these things. She was recognizing that there were many breaches of the First Amendment by religious authorities trying to permit this or that or the other thing. And we're realizing, we finally said, no, that's, you brought in all of this stuff. You're going too far, take it back. And then you can't, because once they have their foot in the door, that's precedent to take over everything else.
Yeah. I mean, this is one of the reasons the history and tradition argument is so bad. And you're right? They're talking about, they're analogizing to this case involving the Bladensburg Cross, and the Bladensburg Cross was up for quite some time, but still, we're talking 100 years at most. But I mean, for the last 45 years, the Supreme Court has said that displaying 10 Commandments in the public school classrooms is unconstitutional. I mean, this was a decision in 1980, Stone versus Graham, which gets mentioned, right? Like, that's the tradition that we have right now. And then they go all the way back to, as you pointed out, to 1690, before there was a United States, before there was a U.S. Constitution, before there was a Bill of Rights, before the separation of church and state had been invented by America, right? Like, we were the country that invented the separation of church and state. And to suggest that because this was happening before that existed means we can do it now it's nonsensical. I mean, look, this is 1690s, before there were public schools. And then they go on and painting.
So we're talking exclusively about Christian schools at that time.
Yes,
I'm sorry,
that's what we're talking about.
I spoke over you there.
And then they go on to, no, it's okay. They go on to paint with this brush and say, well, it's also the foundation of all Western civilization and law. It's the foundation of all morality. And both of those things are just fundamentally, absolutely false. They talk about McGuffey's readers. And I just have to do a quick aside to that. Like, McGuffey was what we would call a Christian nationalist today. He was unabashedly Christian, used all his texts to inculcate religion. He said that Christianity was, quote, the religion of our country. On its doctrines are founded the peculiarities of our free institutions. He warned that teachers and parents need to avoid, quote, teaching to our pupils the crude notions of revolutionary principles of modern infidelity. Again, all this is in the founding myth. But really, I mean, the thing that I think we need to spend some time on is this false notion that the 10 Commandments are the foundation of all Western civilization and law and morality. I mean, get out of here.
Well, the very notion that that is the basis for all Western morality, that alone, I mean, it's bad enough to say that it's the basis of our judicial system when none of these laws are reflected and, in fact, could not be enforced. I mean, there's, of course, perjury has a limited application, and then, of course, murder and theft, which were already criminal everywhere prior to the supposed time of the 10 Commandments. But then look at all of the other commandments. These would be unenforceable violations of human rights. There is no law forcing children to honor their parents, for example. But anyway, moving on to the next thing.
It's remarkable.
When he says that if we had more people
I'd love to get on this.
We must have a delay.
I think we must have a little delay. Yeah.
Yeah. Because I was talking over you and I didn't.
Do you want to pause for a second? Well, you can't pause. Okay. Let me get on my soapbox here for a minute. Because one of the things we have to, first of all, which 10 Commandments are we talking about? Because there are 4 sets of 10 Commandments in any given Bible. And which 10 is our government selecting here for display on the wall? Because different religions, also in Jewish, Catholic, Protestant, they number and interpret the commandments differently. And these are not minor differences, right? Like, what's the difference between graven images and idols? Personally, I don't care. But the church had a civil war about that question in the 8th and 9th centuries over who was right. It's something called the iconoclast controversy. And the morality question, too, is really remarkable because the most famous commandments, the ones in Exodus 20, thanks to Charlton Heston and Nelson DeMille, are far less ethical and moral than I think people realize. And you touched on this already. And yes, some of the Ten Commandments overlap with criminal laws that prohibit murder and theft and perjury right now. But those rules are not exclusive or original to Christianity. They are universal human principles that every successful society we know of has adopted. And there's actually some compelling evidence to suggest that the biblical version of those prohibitions didn't apply to anybody but fellow believers. In other words, that the application of those commandments was based along religious lines, which is kind of what white Christian nationalism is asking for today, right? They're asking for supremacy. And either way, it's really, really difficult to credibly claim that the biblical iterations of those universal rules influenced the founding. And then, as you pointed out, the rest of the Ten Commandments are downright un-American, right? They begin, I am the Lord your God, you shall have no other gods before me, right? That is a divine command that embodies principles that directly conflict with the principles on which the United States was founded, right? Like, no law can tell an American to worship a god, let alone which god to worship. We are free to be godless, as I am and you are and a growing number of Americans are, or if we want, we can worship every god from every holy book. And they continue in this un-American vein, right? They prohibit free expression in art, graven images or idols. They prohibit free speech, taking the Lord's name in vain, but God damn it, this is America. You can blaspheme all you want, right? They sanction slavery twice, Exodus 20:10, and then again in verse 17. They promise to punish, and this is the sticking point for me, because just go read your Ten Commandments, right? The Ten Commandments promise to punish innocent children, quote, to the third and fourth generation, if parents are brazen enough to exercise the religious freedom that is guaranteed in the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. Right. And then you have the 10th commandment, which is maybe the worst. It condones slavery, it treats women as chattel, and it criminalizes thought. Now, you can argue, and I can't get around this, and that slaveholders and misogynists did occasionally cite those commandments to justify their bigotry throughout American history. That's true. I can't deny it. And I've asked Christian nationalists that I've debated why they're so unwilling to claim that influence, but I haven't had a satisfactory influence yet. And I'll pause for a second here, but I'll just say the way the bill is drafted also disproves conclusively the idea that our morality comes from the Ten Commandments. The bill itself they wrote disproves that claim.
Can you explain how it does? Because I was asked to explain how it is that the First Amendment contradicts the First Commandment, and I thought it was a little strange that I would have to flesh that out. But some people need it, so if you would, please.
Yes. Well, I mean, they actually wrote out their particular version. They, being the Texas state legislators who proposed this bill, wrote out their version of the Ten Commandments. They prescribed the holy scripture that is going on. You have state-sanctioned holy scripture, right? They've chosen what version of the Ten Commandments, which interpretation is going to go on that classroom wall. And they've removed a lot of the more morally problematic aspects of the Ten Commandments, including punishing innocent children to the third and fourth generation. So what morality are they using to do that, if not a morality that is independent of those commandments to judge them and judge them wanting and say we need to leave that on the editing room floor, right? So they're disproving their own claims in the bill itself. These are not the basis of our morality or our ethics. And the idea that you don't understand that a statement that begins, I am the Lord your God, you shall have no other gods before me, right? The government adopting that statement and placing it in front of a captive audience of impressionable school children in every single Texas classroom is disgusting. I mean, that is a gross violation of the religious freedom of every single one of those students. And if you're not a Christian nationalist, that becomes very, very obvious very quickly.
He said, if we had more people following the Ten Commandments, we would have a basic moral standard. I got so many arguments against that.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much wrong with it, right? Like people don't read the Ten Commandments and then all of a sudden become more moral. People don't read the Bible and become more moral. That's not the way that morality works. And again, the Ten Commandments as a moral guide, uh, the parts of them that are good and useful and worthwhile are not religious laws. These are universal human principles that these Christian nationalists are trying to claim as their own. But again, every successful society we know of says it's not okay to kill other people or steal from them. Right? These are pretty basic things, rules, moral principles to come up with.
And I'm pretty sure that nobody ever decided not to murder or not to steal something because God said not to. I mean, virtually everybody that goes to prison believes in supernatural things, believes there's a God watching over everything they do. They just do it anyway, right? And then very often they think that, God understands why they did what they did. And God completely agrees with why they did what they did. Oh, yeah, you had to. I know, because that's just the advantage of having a personal God, isn't it?
Yeah, I guess so, yeah.
Chair calls Matt Krause. Good morning.
Morning, Chairman.
We show you registered as Matt Krause on behalf of the First Liberty Institute, testifying for the bill. Is that correct?
Yes, sir. Right. Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, members of the committee, for allowing me to testify today. It was an honor to serve as colleagues with y'all for a long time. And if I didn't say it then, y'all are very smart, very no, I'm just joking. It's an honor to be with you here talking on behalf of Senate Bill 1515. This is a constitutional bill. In fact, First Liberty Institute was the one who represented Coach Kennedy in that Coach Kennedy versus Bremerton case. Before that, a couple years before, in the Bladensburg Peace Cross case, First Liberty also represented the Peace Cross there, which started chipping away at the Lemon Test. As Representative Noble said, for many years, for decades, for centuries, in America, we understood the vital importance of religion, those foundational documents in America, until 1971, when the Lemon Test was instituted. It was a three-pronged, convoluted test, which was used hundreds, if not thousands of times in that 40 years to strike down public displays of religion. Fortunately, in 2022, that was overturned. And as Representative Noble said, it was replaced with a history and tradition test. As my learned former colleague, Representative Tallarico, offered some, hey, would you put this in there? Would you amend this? Would you allow this statement? A lot of good statements. The two greatest commandments that Jesus said, love God and love your neighbor, absolutely are good, but they are not part of that history and tradition that we've seen time and time and time again. And so I'm not sure that would actually stand up in a court of law. We wouldn't want to pass anything that was unconstitutional. First Liberty Institute feels very confident, having been on the leading edge of this fight for a long time, that because of this new test, we can have assurance that posting the 10 Commandments on the walls and doing what we did for hundreds of years in this country will be constitutionally validated. There's no reason to think otherwise with the extreme history and tradition of the 10 Commandments in our government, in our politics, in arts and entertainment. It's ubiquitous in American culture. It will be upheld, and so we feel very confident in that. I'm happy to take any questions that you have, but I do know you have a hard stop. So thank you for allowing me to come and speak on behalf of Representative Noble's bill.
All right. Members, any questions? All right. We appreciate you being here. Good to see you.
Thank you.
So Matt Krause is from First Liberty Institute, and it's really important to understand what First Liberty Institute is, because this organization has had many names over the years. It was called First Liberty, it was called Liberty Institute, it was called Liberty Legal Institute, but it is, at its most basic level, Kelly Shackelford's child. And Kelly Shackelford is a white Christian nationalist out there to privilege conservative white heterosexual Christians. And in 2001, the organization brought in about $565,000. That's it. And back then it was called Liberty Legal Institute, and it was the legal arm of the Free Market Foundation, which is an affiliate of Focus on the Family, which is James Dobson's outfit. And then the Institute kind of gobbled up its mother. And now here in 2019, it's got an income of upwards of $15 million. That was the last number that I looked at. I'm sure it's much more now. And that's partly with the help, by the way, of Supreme Court Justice Sam Alito, who knew and talked up Kelly Shackelford's work to mega donors in the early days. We know about that thanks to a New York Times story that broke last summer. And Shackelford tells this this less than humble creation story about his organization, right? He says this is an American story and it's really a God story about God seeing the need. But the Institute tries, its goal, its aim is to, quote, promote Judeo-Christian values. And it fearmongers about wealthy institutions spending enormous sums of money per year to destroy your religious liberty and scrub references of God from the public square, right? And what the Institute is really seeking, what it is trying, what it wants is Christian supremacy. It has fought to keep evolution out of public schools and fought to keep Bible classes, Jesus portraits, and school-imposed prayer in public schools. And much like these other Christian nationalist crusaders, the Institute wraps this supremacy in religious freedom, which the average American understands as equality. We touched on this earlier, right? So to build the perception that it's fighting for equality rather than supremacy, the Institute will seek out these stories that it can blow out of all proportion and then bend into this Christian persecution narrative. And then it will delay and drag the cases out for years while it fundraises to push the persecution message. And a really good example of that is the praying football coach, the coach who was praying after football games, imposing his prayer on other people's kids at the 50-yard line. We know these kids felt coerced, like they had to pray to play, and they ended up taking that case all the way to the Supreme Court. That is who is advocating for this Ten Commandments bill.
And that's particularly frustrating because that was a case where Supreme Court justices appear to have lied in their ruling. So they're saying that this guy is just doing this private little thing that he has a right to do on the side, and he doesn't, doesn't necessarily involve everybody else. But then there's photographs included in the dissension, which I don't think that's ever happened before, to show the contrary. Can you comment on that?
Yes, absolutely. Because, Krause in his testimony there, he says that he is confident that the bill would be legally validated, right? And this is where his confidence stems from. So let's talk about this case because it really is absolutely fascinating. So at the appellate level, at the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, the court warned that First Liberty Institute, Krause's outfit, was spinning a false, that was their word, false, and, quote, deceitful narrative in that case. I mean, that's mind-blowing. There was 3 judges on this panel. They said this: the facts in the record utterly belie the coach's contention that the prayer was personal and private. And then there's this line, I went and looked it up before our interview because I have to share it, because one of the appellate court judges actually hammered another judge for buying into these lies, buying into this deceitful narrative. And this is what Judge Smith wrote. He wrote, "Unlike Odysseus, who was able to resist the seductive song of the sirens by being tied to a mast and having his shipmates stop their ears with beeswax, our colleague, Judge O'Scanlan, appears to have succumbed to the siren song of a deceitful narrative of this case spun by counsel for the appellant, to the effect that Joseph Kennedy, a Bremerton High School football coach, was disciplined for holding silent private prayers. That narrative is false." And then he goes on to say, "The reader should know the following basic truth. Kennedy was never disciplined by the high school for offering silent private prayers." And then he goes on to compare these deceitful, unmoored claims, that's another phrase he uses, unmoored claims, side by side with reality in a chart. Like a chart, like here's what they are saying, here's what actually happened in reality. I have never seen that in a federal opinion. Another judge in the case explained that the actual record presented in the district court bears little resemblance to the hypothetical scenarios posited by Coach Kennedy, right? And then, as you pointed out, by the time it gets to the Supreme Court, you have the justices in the dissent including photographic evidence showing that this is not a private, personal, quiet prayer, that it's happening at the 50-yard line with students involved. Now, I don't know, about you, but if federal judges said about your work, your litigation, your claims to the court that you were spinning a deceitful narrative and that they were false, I would go hide my head in shame, right? I would take a sabbatical and question what I was doing with my life. Maybe I'd go read up on some moral philosophy outside the 10 Commandments, right? Like maybe I would take some ethics classes that they have for lawyers. But instead, First Liberty Institute appealed to the Supreme Court. After being called out like this by several federal judges, they repeated the false and deceitful narratives to the justices. I mean, just think about what that says. Like, think about how confident they must have been that their deceitful narrative would fall on friendly ears. And the worst part is they were right. It's terrible.
That does seem to be the plan, doesn't it? I mean,
yeah.
The reason I became an activist so many years ago was because I got tapped into a number of people that were bragging about how all their ministers across the state had been on the phone with each other to get everybody to get their congregations to vote as a block so that they could position certain judges and senators in what they imagined to be a culture war, wherein they just expected to get all of the authorities, because that's the only thing they understand, is authorities to rule in their favor.
Can we also just pause to appreciate how shitty a phrase culture war is, right? Like it's not a culture war to debate whether or not somebody has the right to exist or to debate somebody's equality, right? That phrase is so often used to mask human rights. And this is just a personal pet peeve as of late. Once I noticed it, now I can't stop noticing it. Watch when people use the phrase culture war, especially on the right, and what they're actually trying to do with it. Anyway, unrelated to the testimony.
It does seem that Christian values are always based on hatred and intolerance. It's always prejudicial bigotry. That's what a value is.
That's the goal of white Christian nationalism, right? Like the goal of white Christian nationalism is a country where conservative, white, heterosexual, cisgender Christian men are privileged, are above the law, are a special favored class, and everybody else is second-class citizens, where they are protected by the law, but not bound by it, and where everybody else is bound by the law, but not protected. Right, that's the entire goal of this exclusionary movement, and these bills that we're seeing in Texas, not just the 10 Commandments bill, but the school prayer bill that's up there, the vouchers bill that they were debating earlier today, the chaplains in school. All of these bills are meant to do that, to reach that end goal.
He also said that the 10 Commandments were ubiquitous in American culture.
Yeah, I think he's talking about Nelson DeMille's movie. I mean,
okay.
that's also just not the legal test, right? Like the test is not, are these things popular in certain places? The crazy thing about this is a group that claims to be for religious liberty, claims to be for religious freedom. But this very clearly violates the religious freedom of every single Texas student, every single Texas family. We're hearing so much about parental rights. It's up to the parents to decide what religion, if any, their children are exposed to and when. It is not up to the state to use the machinery of the state to impose one particular religion on everybody else's children. That is fundamentally a violation of everybody's religious freedom. And if this group were truly for religious freedom and religious liberty, it would be speaking up against this bill instead of backing it and testifying in its favor.
The guy also said, Matt Krause said that this is a constitutional bill. And it's wholly, obviously, I think, unconstitutional on its face. But he says it's constitutional, and he said it 2 or 3 times. So did you just have to tell people it's constitutional so they just believe it without question?
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the best ways to get people to believe a lie is to repeat it. I mean, their argument goes to the idea that there is effectively what they are arguing is that there is no longer a separation of church and state because of what they've been able to do at the Supreme Court. Now,
and then they argue
that's certainly not the case.
That there never was one.
Yes, they do that too. Yeah. It's really worth remembering again that the separation of church and state is what guarantees true religious freedom. Like, if you care about religious liberty, you ought to be fighting for the separation of church and state, not against it, not trying to undermine it. It's a dead giveaway that this group is fighting for white Christian nationalism and not true religious liberty or liberty in any way, shape, or form.
Can we? Okay. Usually have somebody. Okay, that was good. Chair calls Jennifer Bates. Jennifer Bates. Okay, we'll show Jennifer Bates on behalf of herself, registered against the bill and not testifying. Chair calls Carissa Lopez. Okay, 2-minute time limit here. We'll show you register as Carissa Lopez on behalf of the Texas Freedom Network and yourself, testifying against the bill. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
You may begin.
Good morning, committee members. Thank you so much for having me and getting me in nice and early. My name is Carissa Lopez. I'm the political director of the Texas Freedom Network, an organization of parents, clergy, young people, and other Texans who support public education and religious freedom. TFN strongly opposes SB 1515. As Texas children walk through their school doors, they have the opportunity to better their lives and future. And when they walk through those doors, they don't leave behind their beliefs, thoughts, or ideals. In requiring Texas public schools to display the 10 Commandments in every classroom, this bill is forcing Christianity into classrooms and alienating multitudes of children of other faith and no faith in the process. Religious freedom is a fundamental value in Texas and across the United States that commands that we have the right to practice the faith of our choice or none at all, free of government interference or involvement. When one faith is used to guide public policy, that endangers religious freedom for all of us. As we see it, SB 1515 is not about religious freedom, but about control. Families should be the one who get to direct religious education of their children, not government mandates that require specific language in our classroom. I urge you to take back religious freedom for all Texans by voting no on SB 1515. Thank you.
All right, members, any questions for this witness? All right, we appreciate you being here.
I think Texas Freedom Network does phenomenal work, and everybody ought to go support them to the extent that they're able. They've been on the ground in Texas for a long time. They're doing amazing work.